Welcome to a new episode in our series Divination and Magic in the 21st Century. Today we have a very special guest from Connecticut, I believe.
Connecticut, yes.
That is Dr. Anthony Lewis, and we will take the computer for it and have a look what we're doing today. You find the special site for this talk on our address astrotalk. .vonabisw.de, and if you go to the neueste Beiträge, you find the talk with Dr. Anthony Lewis here. And we will do in the series Divination and Magic in the 21st Century how Anthony became what he is, an intellectual biography divided in a couple of chapters. The first three are becoming a psychiatrist, the professional career. Chapter 2, the context, family life and community where he was living, what he was doing, all the surrounding social aspects. And then in the chapter 3, we dive into some astrological and tarot aspects, but we will not repeat what you can find in this film list. This video is a diary of entry with his host, and the second video is a very interesting video about blending traditional and modern astrology, where Anthony is talking about his becoming astrologer as well, so we don't have to repeat that. So let's start with chapter 1. Anthony, you became a psychiatrist. Let's start with your high school days.
Okay.
You were sort of a science nerd, buff or whatever. Did you experience in some of the television series, if somebody in high school is into science, he's a nerd and he gets bullied? Did you experience anything of this bullying because you were interested in science subjects, or were you one of the leading figures in your high school?
Neither. I don't feel I was bullied, and I wasn't a leading figure. But I was deeply interested in science, and my friends tended to have similar interests. So I had a group of friends who would get together, talk about science, do experiments, enter science fairs, things like that.
Did you participate in these American, how do you call it? If you competitions in your country, high schools have these competitions in science affairs. Did you participate in that?
Yes, a friend of mine entered a science fair in high school, and our project was to build a photocell from scratch.
Oh, great.
An operating photocell that would generate current and light a little, like battery light up.
Yes, great. And how did you experience high school as a whole? Was that an experience which you would like to do again if you had the chance to start over? Or would you say this education system in your country is just unbelievable bad? What's your opinion on that?
It was mixed. There were some very good teachers and some very bad teachers.
So like everybody else
right.
all over the world. Okay. So
my science and math teachers tended to be better than
I
had good English teachers. My worst teachers were history teachers. I ended up hating history as a subject during high school.
Okay.
Because it basically was memorizing facts and spitting them out on an exam. I still remember one of the American history exam. I still remember a question in 1908. How many miles of roads were paved in the United States?
That's a great
I don't know I don't remember the answer. I knew it for the test.
Yes,
but why that was important to memorize and spit out is beyond me.
Yeah, it's beyond me too. Okay, so in the end, you graduated from high school in what age? How old were you?
Probably about 18.
18. So that's more or less like in my country too.
1945, and I graduated in 1963. Yeah.
Okay, and you have the certificate of the high school diploma in your hands. What did you do then? Had you already applied for a college?
Yeah, I had applied to college, and I entered college in the fall after finishing high school.
And which college was that?
I went to a small Jesuit college in Connecticut, Fairfield University.
Okay. Are you Catholic?
I was brought up Catholic. Now I'm a non-practicing, I don't know what.
A non-practicing, I don't know
Catholic, right?
You're still a registered Catholic. You give some money to the Catholic Church.
No, I'm
Oh, okay.
involved to some extent with Catholic organizations, charitable
Okay.
organizations that I donate to, but I
Yeah,
don't attend
that's the
church.
liberty in your country. In my country, if you
Yeah,
are a registered Catholic, you have to pay taxes even if you don't want to. It's
yeah.
it's organized by the state for the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. But this is different in your country. Your country churches have to deal with their believers directly, and if you don't want to pay money, you don't have to. Okay, so in that Jesuit college, Jesuit education is normally rather strict. Was this a strict college?
I wouldn't say particularly strict. It was strict in the sense that they expected, unlike some colleges, students to learn
Yeah, that's
and
what I mean. It was stricter
attend
than normal colleges.
classes, right? It wasn't a party school, let me put it that
Yeah,
way.
that's what I mean. So
Yeah,
basically, you had the advantage of some oversight that you didn't waste your time in college by doing partying all the time, and
right. It
you
was
did
more
learn something.
serious than party. Yeah.
What were your subjects? What did you learn in your Jesuit college?
Well, I majored in mathematics and minored in physics.
Okay, and that was all you studied? Nothing else? No,
Oh,
no
no, no,
general.
no. It was a liberal arts education. So we had
Oh,
to, because it was a Jesuit college, there were certain theology courses we had to take that were required. English literature, a foreign language. I actually took a little bit of German, which I don't remember.
oh, okay. I will do some advertising for a new book in astrology in Germany. You might try to read it again and get up
Yeah.
to date.
Well, the problem with the way languages were taught was the emphasis was on grammar and grammar exercises.
Oh,
So to this day, I can actually read a German sentence, not understand the vocabulary, but I can tell you if it's grammatically correct.
not really helpful for everyday life. Okay, very good. So mathematics and physics, and after 4 years, you graduated?
Right. It was liberal arts, so there was math and physics, but English, foreign language, history, art appreciation, music. It was a very balanced
Fairly widely spread education.
philosophy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And 4 years or 3 years?
4 years.
4 years. So we are now in 1967 something?
Yes, I graduated 67.
And now you have the diploma of this Bachelor of Arts, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
or Bachelor of Science. What was it?
It was a Bachelor of Science because of my major being
Yeah.
math and
Okay.
physics. Yeah.
So Bachelor of Science. And that was when the Vietnam War exploded, sort of.
Exactly. Yeah.
And in one of the videos in the film list, I was telling you, the viewers, where you can watch a lot of the biography of Anthony. Were you drafted right away, or how did that go along?
No, I had decided to pursue a doctorate in mathematics. So I had begun graduate school in New York in Fordham University.
Okay.
In a doctoral program in mathematics. My intention, because I always loved teaching, was to become a teacher of mathematics at a university level.
You wanted to become a teacher, not to avoid the draft, but to be a teacher on your own volition?
That was a goal I'd had since childhood. I always loved teaching. I love learning and I love teaching.
Okay. Okay. So basically, you had the advantage that at the same time when this Vietnam thing was going on, that there was a shortage of teachers, and you could avoid the draft because you became a teacher.
Well, that came a little later. The doctorate in mathematics, what happened was I had done well in college, and I applied for a scholarship.
Yes.
And at that time, the space program, Sputnik, had happened, and there was a space race, and NASA was offering scholarships to people in the sciences. So I applied for a scholarship. My academic record was good, and I got a full scholarship to do a doctorate.
Okay.
So that was very nice. I didn't have to worry about money because I came from a family that wasn't very well to do, so that I could only afford graduate school with scholarship help. So I began this program, and I think after 2 years, in 1969 was the height of the Vietnam War, and there was a lottery for the draft, who would go. And I came out, it's the only lotto I've ever won, with a fairly low number, and the lower the number, the more likely you were to be drafted. And I had been throughout college politically very opposed to the war. I had participated in protests, organized protests, written. I used to write a column in the college newspaper. Actually, I was editor of our college newspaper. And so I had a long history of being opposed to this war. I thought it was...
Were you engaged in the SDS in America?
Not directly with the I was a sympathizer.
Okay. Even you were doing studies at a Jesuit college, you were
yes.
sympathizing with the revolutionary touch of the SDS people.
Yes. And I would write editorials because I was the editor of the college newspaper at the time.
Okay.
And I would get feedback, written feedback from other students. If you love the commies so much, move to Vietnam and things like that.
So your companion students were more on the Jesuit side of politics.
No, it was mixed. There were many students who agreed with me, and there was a fairly large group of students who were very, quote, patriotic and thought the United States could do no wrong. And if we entered a war, it was for a good cause always. And
how about the higher echelons of the college? How did you get a response from the administration of the college?
They were very good. They really kept, it was a student newspaper. I had a faculty advisor, but who really kept his distance. I mean, he would make sure we didn't do ridiculous things in the newspaper, like publish pornography and things like that.
Yeah, okay.
But when it came to expressing opinions and First Amendment rights, he was very good.
Okay. So 2 years into graduate school for mathematics, the option to get drafted, a rather realistic option. Right. What did you do?
So I was extremely opposed to the war on my own political and moral grounds, and decided that I would not go to Vietnam. So the choices were
Canada.
At that time, some people were fleeing to Canada, which I didn't want to do.
Okay.
The other option was, because there was a teacher shortage, if I began teaching at a high school level, I could be deferred. So okay. I looked for a job. They were desperate for math teachers. So there was a school in New York City I began to teach at. I taught math then for 2 or 3 years after that.
How did you feel about teaching math, realizing your dream job? How was the reality of the dream?
I'd always wanted to be a math teacher, so that was satisfying, but I wanted to teach at a higher level.
Oh, you wanted to teach in college?
Yes.
That's why you wanted to go for the PhD?
Exactly.
Okay. So a dream half realized, and you got frustrated.
Right. Well, the frustration was because I was teaching full time, and I was living in the Bronx and teaching in Manhattan. The commute was at 2 hours a day back and forth.
Oh, yes.
And then on top of that, I was trying to attend classes in the evening, and it became impossible to do doctoral level work and teach full time.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided I had done enough credits to get a master's degree. So I decided to stop at the master's level. So I have the master's degree in theoretical mathematics. And it was just practically impossible in my life to find enough hours to do doctoral work and teach full time.
You were still single at that time, I believe.
I was single at the time, yeah. And at the same time, I had some friends who were in the sciences or in math who had gone to medical school. And it occurred to me that that might be a good option. Now, I had actually, being interested in science as a teenager, had always thought of going to medical school, but I thought, given the family I came from not being very well-to-do, and that I could never afford medical school. There's no way I could pay for it. And, but at the time, I guess partly because of the war, there was a shortage of doctors. So I applied for a scholarship and won a scholarship to go to medical school, and decided if I had it to do over, I probably would have done a path leading toward medicine. So in a way, the Vietnam War sort of took me off the path I was on and put me onto a path that I probably would have preferred had I thought it was possible. And I ended up going to medical school, I think starting in 71.
Which one?
Albert Einstein Medical School in the Bronx.
Oh, okay.
A wonderful medical school.
When we are talking about medical school, is that the whole program you did, or could you skip the science part before the clinic part?
No, medical school in the United States it's like a doctoral school. It's a postgraduate school.
Yes.
You finish your university.
Post BA school, I would
post
say.
BA, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And most people do the pre-medical sciences and the BA level and then enter medical school.
Oh, okay. So in the medical school, there are always clinical semesters. You are in the hospital?
No. You begin with a year or two of basic science because it's so important. You had the bachelor's,
you had the bachelor science, and even though after the bachelor degree, you still have to do another 2 years on the sciences in medical school.
Right, because in my college, I had not taken biochemistry. I hadn't taken certain biology courses.
Okay.
I had to make those up on my own time, which I did.
Yes.
And then in medical school, you really have to know your biochemistry very well, your pharmacology, physiology, anatomy, all the basic stuff. And that takes a year or two to go through and really master.
Okay.
And then you do the clinical rotations for a couple of years after that.
How many years?
And then I did it in a total of 3 years. They had a program that offered, usually it's 4 years, but because I was older and wanted to get it done, I entered this program. And basically you went all summer. It was 3 years, almost nonstop. It was too much. If I had to do over, I would never do 3 years again.
Okay.
I would spread it out over 4 years because there's too much to learn and master.
Okay. I'm trying to compare it with German relationship. We are now before the first examination for the doctorate in Germany. You do an exam after these 3 years, right?
There's what we call board examinations, medical board, and you're expected to pass the board, and it's a national exam that shows you learned a certain amount that qualifies you. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be in German die erste medizinische Staatsprüfung. Okay. And after this examination, do you then go into residency?
Right. The medical school gives you the basic, what we call MD degree, Doctor of Medicine.
Yes.
But that's without a specialty. And then you specialize.
Okay.
So after that, I had decided on going to psychiatry during medical school.
Why?
There were 3 areas I really liked in medical school. Internal medicine fascinated me because you really had to know the body. And then if you had a symptom, figure out how is the body producing this symptom? And there could be multiple ways that happened. And then how can I treat the patient to alleviate the symptom or the underlying disease? And it was just like a puzzle. It was very curious, very interesting. I love surgery. For the opposite reason, surgery was very precise and hands-on. You identified a problem, you had a solution, you went in with your scalpel, you fixed it, sewed the person up, and they got better. But surgeons had to get up at 4 or 5 in the morning to start their rounds, and I knew that I could never be a morning person. So I ruled out surgery. And psychiatry fascinated me for several reasons. One, at the time I was there, Einstein had a superb psychiatry department, and they were doing state-of-the-art research into brain, how the brain worked, how certain psychiatric illnesses or disorders were related to brain functioning, and publishing. And I worked with one of my teachers, was a national leading expert who published a lot of papers, and I worked with him on some research projects as a student helper. And that was fascinating. At the same time, there was a very strong psychoanalytic group at the school, involved in teaching psychiatry. And I had read Freud's interpretation of dreams during college and was fascinated because he studied the whole history of dreams, the whole literature, and then ended up with his own findings and his ideas about how the mind worked. And this totally fascinated me. And so I decided I just like psychiatry too much to not.
You are touching on the difference between psychology and psychiatry. If you're talking about psychoanalytics,
Yes.
Did you study the history of psychoanalytics, Freud, Jung,
Yes.
Adler, and Reich?
Yes.
What's your opinion on Reich?
Uh,
A very special American story. You might know it.
yeah. I'd have to think about that. I can't just off the top of my
so
head.
we'll do a second talk about
Sure.
Anthony Lewis and his opinion on Wilhelm Reich. In Germany, if you study psychology and psychiatry, you will never find in any university outfit the teaching of C.G. Jung. Did you encounter C.G. Jung in your university study, in your medical school studies?
Interestingly, no. It wasn't. Jung wasn't taught. The psychoanalytic psychiatrists would periodically refer to Jung. Oh yes, and we did read. I don't think it was in medical school. It was more in my psychiatric residency. We did read papers by Jung. He had some early papers. I'd say 1901, 1908, that period. He did experiments with word association. It's a wonderful paper. I have it somewhere.
Yeah. Okay. Did you encounter the history of Uranus in Ascona? The conferences of Uranus with C.G. Jung and all these brilliant scholars who went there once a year from 1932 till his.
Didn't.
Oh, okay. So Uranus is nothing in your biography.
No.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
No. So my interest in Jung was more personal and not something I was taught. I was very interested in Freud, especially because I was so impressed by the interpretation of dreams. And I actually pursued training in Freudian psychoanalysis.
So you wouldn't know this story with Tony Wolff, would you?
No.
Okay. So finishing studies in psychiatry, how does this end? You get a diploma and you are a psychiatrist, a medical psychiatrist, to put it
Correct,
this way?
yeah.
And is that in America the same like in Germany? The medical psychiatrists are the ones who basically work in the institutions, and the psychologists are basically working outside the institution. Is that the same thing in your country?
When I was in training, no.
Okay.
We both medical psychiatrists and psychologists would work within hospitals. Okay. I think that may have changed.
Who was the chieftain? The medical part, and the other ones were working towards you, or were you
at that time? I'd say the medical doctors were more in charge because they were hospital settings.
Yes,
yes. Now, but there was not an antagonism. It was more.
Okay, let's
like
dig into
teams.
That.
There was usually a team of a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a social worker, a nurse.
Yes.
And then students.
Let's dig into that. The first job you had after graduation of psychiatry, doctor, what was the first hospital you were working in?
I worked in an inpatient psychiatric hospital, specifically psychiatric, non-medical, for people with severe psychiatric disorders, mainly young people, with adolescents.
Like schizophrenia?
Schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, yeah.
Okay, good. That gives me the reason to ask you about in my opinion, the scandal with the Association for Psychiatrists of America. You ever heard the name Abramhofer?
No.
And niacin in schizophrenia treatment?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, for our viewers, that's something for you to look up. There is a book on the market, The Niacin, The Real Story. Professor Dr. Hoffer was the chief researcher in Saskatchewan in Canada, and he was treating schizophrenia patients with niacin high dose, and he got good results. And the American Psychiatrist Association tried to what do you say, to hoax him, to say false things. But we will leave that aside. That's for anybody to study. The book is called Niacin, The Real Story. Okay, did you ever encounter the orthomolecular approach in psychiatry?
Orthomolecular meaning?
Meaning
I've
high
heard the
doses,
term, but
high doses of micronutrients, like niacin or
yeah,
vitamins.
I've heard of it, but I don't have any experience with
you
it.
You never applied it for your patients.
No.
Okay.
I tended to be fairly mainstream.
You start your job in this hospital with these very people with very heavy diseases, right? Let's put it this way. Was it basically a therapy based on drugs, or did you do these worse things like electroshocks and all that?
It was an interesting mix of what at that time was considered evidence-based medical treatment, which included mainly medications. There were, this was in this probably late 70s. So there were drugs like Haldol, Thorazine. The newer antipsychotics were not available. Lithium was used in bipolar patients. So there was a small group of drugs, and there were some antidepressants being used. And we didn't use things without good research evidence. You know, it was a Yale University-based program, so you really had to justify from the literature what you were doing. So you wouldn't use a treatment that didn't have solid journal articles to support what you were doing. And at the same time, there was very active psychological treatment so that everybody had an individual therapist. Everybody had a family therapist.
Which tradition was in your concrete hospital the main tradition? When I attended the World Conference on Psychology and Psychiatry in Vienna in 2002, I was rather amazed that Carl Rogers was sort of excluded. It was a separate room. Nobody wanted to talk about Carl Rogers. How about your hospital? Was the tradition of Carl Rogers relevant or irrelevant in this psychological part?
I'm trying to think. He wasn't dismissed. We had read Rogers. It was a fairly eclectic, leaning toward Freudian, in the sense that the idea was everybody, regardless of whether they have a major psychiatric disorder that they're hospitalized for or not, has certain dynamic issues that they're dealing with, certain emotional conflicts that they need to deal with. And that being labeled a psychiatric patient and being in a hospital and separated from family and friends certainly had psychological consequences. In addition, if you spent your day hearing voices or seeing things no one else could see, that had an impact on your personality. So the idea was to help people deal with their symptoms, understand their symptoms, find ways to cope with them. And the family work became very important because when a member of a family is very sick, it affects the entire family. And the reactions toward the sick person or the reactions of the sick person toward the family can mushroom and make things worse. So it was very important that the whole family be worked with and not just the individual.
We are talking about the 70s when you were working in this hospital.
Yes,
right?
Yeah. It was a very synthetic, eclectic approach.
And that was in New York City?
No, this was in New Haven, Connecticut.
New Haven, Connecticut. Okay. In the 70s, that is you are your contemporary of a development in California and called Esalen, Murphy's and Price Foundation of Esalen and Big Sur. And there they started the human potential movement. and many big thinkers were going there. Did that affect your work in your hospital? Did they get to know about this development in Big Sur, Esalen, or was it outside your horizon?
We knew about it, but that seemed to be for people who are fairly well integrated, and you wouldn't subject a person who's suffering from psychosis to that kind of opening up and unstructured environment, because it would cause them to fall apart.
Okay. How about yourself? How interested were you in this human potential movement, privately or outside the job?
I thought it was interesting. I observed it from a distance. Some of it, to me, seemed fairly gimmicky and way out there. I thought my impression was it promised much more than it could deliver, that the path to maturity and integration was not sudden bursts of insight or disruption of the personality, but was a more, in my view, a more integrated step-by-step process.
Yes.
So,
considering the fact that in these two videos here, the first one and the second one, especially the first one, you were talking with your host about the parallel development of your interest in astrology and tarot. So I was wondering, you are now a licensed, a professional psychiatrist, and you got to know a little bit about Esalen. And in Esalen, there were two figures rather interesting. That was Stanislav Grof and Richard Tarnas. And they were working on the astrological side with the prenatal experiences. Did you ever, did the theme, the topic, prenatal astrological experience, did that reach your ear? Did you find out that they were doing this research work?
I had heard about it. I'm basically a skeptic.
Okay.
So I would call myself a skeptical astrologer.
So Cosmos and Psyche is not your cup of tea, the book, the large book from Richard Tarnas?
I've read it. Parts of it I've enjoyed.
Okay.
Actually, before Tarnas, this was back in, I can't remember the year now. There was a graduate student at Yale in history who had heard from friends who knew me that I did astrology. And he called me up, and I don't remember his name now, it wasn't Richard, but he had begun studying historical figures and their lives and their role in history by looking at their charts and correlating their charts with the formal history that was being taught. And he consulted me several times about different charts. And for the life of me, I don't remember his name. This was all by telephone. But it was kind of similar to what Richard was doing. Richard was doing it more on a global scale.
So you being a skeptic by heart, does that mean that the work in California of the California Institute for Integrated Studies, CIIS, that didn't touch your interest?
Well, my view is if you start talking about periods, either past lives or prenatal periods, how do you do an experiment to show that what you're hypothesizing is true or not? How do you verify?
You don't. There's no double check blind study for that. Yeah.
And so if something can't be verified, it becomes a matter of faith.
Yes. Yes, like Gustav Adolf Schröder in his Habilitationsschrift, Astrology in the history of astrology in the Europäischen Religionsgeschichte, astrology in the history of religion in Europe. He says astrology is founded in sort of religious context and not in a scientific context. So, and you are in this very problematic state that you want to do astrology and you want to be a skeptic and you want to do scientific research, but you realize it's not possible. So you had to resort to some sort of astrological fate, right?
Right. Actually, I think this may sound a little weird, but going back to high school, my very favorite subject in high school was Euclidean geometry.
Okay.
And I loved it. When I started geometry, I'd heard stories from other kids, oh, it's difficult, you're going to hate it. From the first day, when I saw what it was trying to do, that there were axioms. You stated what you believed to be true, your axioms. And then from those axioms, you could prove logically, step by step, everything else in the system. And as long as the axioms were true, you knew that everything else in the system was true, or at least verifiable.
Yeah.
But and so I was so fascinated by Euclidean geometry. I went to the library and began to read about geometry and discovered there were non-Euclidean geometries.
Yes.
And that you could have geometry of curved space. And that Einstein, in thinking about this, developed his whole theory of relativity, which changed entirely our view of reality. And so that model is the same model I just was absorbed by and took into astrology. That astrology, like all systems, begins with basic axioms, which are matters of belief, of faith.
Yes. Yes.
You can't prove them.
Okay.
Probably. But once you say you believe them, they lead to necessary consequences. If you change an axiom, you change the whole system, because there's repercussions throughout the whole system. No, I forget how we got into it. I was answering your question about.
Oh, it's the CIS. It stems from CIS.
Right.
And your skeptical approach, and the problem that the skeptical approach doesn't really work in astrology. So you had to resort to this sort of theory axioms, and then you have a solid ground because you believe the axioms, and if you have the axiom, then the rest is science.
Right.
Okay, you are a long-standing member of the Astrological Association of Connecticut, right?
Right. Yeah.
Did you ever meet Glenn Perry there? Because he
Yeah.
came from CIS in California, and then he came to Connecticut to his school to find his school there, founding his school. So he was in your association as well.
Yeah, it's a group that's been meeting. I don't know, at least 40 years, if not longer. I forget the date it was founded. It's on the internet. And I joined it, I think, in the late 1980s.
Yes.
And have been going to meetings since. I mean, not recently because of COVID, but they have monthly meetings where they invite a guest speaker, except during the summer months.
Like Robert Hand from The Next State.
Right. And so I used to go to these meetings whenever I could, and we had wonderful speakers. Robert Hand was a regular because he lived very close by, and he was wonderful. Bruce Schofield, brilliant astrologer. Joseph Crane, I think you just interviewed.
Yes.
He would come in lecture. And we had access to people. Boston, New York was fairly close, so they could drive.
Was there a speaker who influenced you personally? Who changed your approach?
Well, I loved Robert Hand. I would always go when he was speaking, and he was very influential.
Okay.
Bruce Schofield is just brilliant, and Bruce impressed me because he's very, very smart. He knows the astronomy, the mathematics, and the astrology extremely well. And Bruce had introduced me to Robert Zoller. So speaking to Robert, Zoller told me I should study Marinus.
Okay.
For
the German viewers, he means Morin de Villefranche, a French philosopher, mathematician, and astrologer who was doing astrology for the French court as a lady from California did for Ronald Reagan, and a French lady did for Mitterrand. So this Morinus is a rather famous figure in the French court history.
Right, and in astrology.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's go back to your hospital. Let's take a day where in the evening there is a session of the Astrological Association of Connecticut. Now let's start with breakfast in your hospital. How does a day like this, in the evening, the part which you wouldn't disclose during the daytime to your colleagues, how was your day and then the evening, and how did they go together? And how much did your colleagues know what you were doing?
Well, I didn't broadcast the fact that I did astrology, but people knew it. I mean, my friends knew it. I didn't hide it. It's just, but I had no reason to go into a hospital and say I do astrology. I was there to see patients and be a psychiatrist.
So you are married already, or are you still single?
I got married in 1977. Yeah.
So you are married now.
Yeah.
Where did you live?
In Connecticut, near New Haven, in a small
Okay.
town. Yeah.
And you met your wife during your studies in the medical school, I believe.
Yeah, she's a psychologist, and we met
Yes.
in a hospital. We were both working in the same hospital, and that's how we met.
Where was that?
In New Haven.
In New Haven already.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah, we
did you?
both did our training at Yale
And
in psychology and
when did the
psychiatry.
first child arrive?
My first son was born in 81, and my second son in 84.
So let's take a day in the hospital in 85. Two children, breakfast, the rush hour for the family.
Right.
When did you start working?
And I was in psychoanalytic training at that time too. So I had an additional 15, 20 hours a week.
Yes, very good.
I
That
didn't
sounds
sleep.
like
I
a
didn't
lot of
sleep
stress.
much. Yeah, I didn't sleep much.
Okay.
But if I could, the meetings were in the evening, 7 p.m. They still are. And they were a little under an hour drive from where I live.
Okay.
So I would have my day in the hospital, get a bite to eat, drive up.
No, not so fast. Tell us about the day. How does a normal day before the evening in with Rob Hand, how does a normal day look like in those days, let's say 1985? You
I
had
usually
breakfast, I
started,
suppose, in the morning
yeah, I
together?
would get up, have breakfast,
Yeah.
go to work. Usually I started about 8 in the morning and would
What
finish.
you come in the hospital, you have an ordination room for yourself, or were you a doctor without his own office?
I had an office.
You had an office.
Yeah.
And how did the professional day start? Did you see patients one by one through the morning?
Depending, it would vary day to day. The day usually began with what we called morning rounds, in
Yes.
which the group that was treating these patients would all get together, talk about anything that had happened overnight or the previous day that we needed to attend to, anything coming up that day that we needed to attend to, any concerns they had, so that everybody working as a team was on board with what was happening to all the patients under our care.
Did you do Barling groups separately for individual patients?
The therapy meetings?
I think you call you psychology people call this Barling groups. This is sort of a supervised setting for one. You are discussing one patient, I believe. I'm not a medical guy.
Yes, we did that too.
You did that extra. That was an extra session for individual patients.
We'd have a general meeting that everybody attended to give an overview of the whole day.
Okay.
So nurses, doctors, social workers, everybody.
Yes.
That was some sort of more administrative, but partly clinical. Like today, we're having 3 admissions. So somebody's coming at 2 o'clock. We have to have a team ready to greet them, et cetera. And then we would have individual meetings about individual patients to review how they were doing and what each member of the team was doing with them.
And did you follow these Barling rules, or did you have your own rules doing these special sessions?
There weren't really rules. It was more common sense.
Okay. Okay.
Like what's happened? Were there any side effects of the medication?
Yes.
Did the person sleep okay last night? Were there any problems with other patients? Any news from the family? I mean, it was just common sense.
And how did the interaction with the patients themselves take place? In the morning or in the afternoon?
It varied day to day. It depended on the rest of your schedule, and you would need to schedule the patient in during your working hours, and it had to be at a reasonable time.
In this sort of hospital you were working in, was there something like an emergency situation feasible, or was your hospital? Oh, you had emergency cases where some rush came in.
There were emergencies in the sense that periodically people who are psychotic or manic will become out of control, or may attempt suicide, or punch a nurse or punch a doctor, or things like that, start a fire.
those would be emergency inside patients in the hospital already there.
Yeah.
Was there work in this hospital where people were rushed with an ambulance from outside?
Oh no, this was a freestanding psychiatric treatment hospital, so it wasn't an emergency room setting.
Okay, and what does that mean, freestanding psychiatric hospital?
Meaning the purpose of the hospital was to give longer term treatment to people who had severe disorders.
Okay, so basically we are talking about emergency situations coming out of the hospital inside, but no outside.
No, if someone had an acute emergency in the community, they would be brought to the general hospital emergency room.
Okay, and how long did this profession take your time? How long did you practice as a professional psychiatrist in this sort of hospital setting?
Well, that was my first position once I finished the residency. And then the following year, I took a different position in a clinic, more of a walk-in clinic, running the crisis program, where people in crisis would come seeking treatment.
So you didn't like this closed in internal hospital?
No, it wasn't that I didn't like it. It was that I just felt I wanted to do something different. I'd been working in inpatient hospital settings for 4 years, and I wanted to have the experience of working more in an outpatient setting. And
what happened there? How was the day-to-day life there?
It was somewhat similar in that the people we treated weren't hospitalized, but they had similar problems.
Okay.
They would come in from the community, and we had to have a team ready to work with them and provide treatment and follow them and so on.
And how long did you do that?
I did that for several years, but I changed hospitals at one point. I went from the initial community setting after 3 or 4 years to another clinic nearby. And then I did that clinic for several years, probably into the 80s. And then at the end of the 80s, I took a position in another city, doing similar work, working in a crisis program, running a crisis program, basically.
A crisis program inside a hospital?
As part of a psychiatric hospital that had both inpatient and outpatient.
Oh, okay. So that's
it was
sort
a
of
state hospital.
Combining your biography in a new place.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. And how long did you do that?
I did that from the late 1980s until I retired a few years ago.
So that was a position you stayed?
Yes.
Okay, how did that combining in internalized or institutionalized patients and walk-in patients and walk-out patients, how did that day look like?
Well, again, since I was in charge of the program.
Yeah, administration. I suppose a lot of your administration.
Part of it was administrative. We always began with a morning meeting to plan the day, just so that everybody was organized and on board and had the same goal in mind for that day. And then we began seeing patients. And that was unpredictable because it was a walk-in crisis center. So any type of problem could appear. So, I mean, the most common things were people who were very anxious or depressed or contemplating suicide. But occasionally we'd get people who were very disorganized, psychotic, high on drugs and dangerous in that sense, sometimes homicidal people. It was really...
So one could say you are sort of parallelizing, or however English word is, you were doing what Ziggy Jung did. He started in an internal hospital in Burghölzli in Zurich, and after a couple of years, he started in his free practice. You never did your own free practice.
I did. I never did it full time. I had a small private practice because I was so busy with so many things.
Yeah, okay.
And then when I moved to my final position, I gradually faded out my private practice because it was just too many hours.
Yes.
I didn't have the time.
So the time lapse, Jung practiced from 1900, I believe, on the Burghölzli till he died in 1961. You are sort of a follow-up colleague, but you're a colleague. You're doing the same work, right? But
similar, yeah.
But I believe you didn't do what Jung did with Tony Wolff together and Emma Wolff, Emma Jung, his wife, and some other colleagues in Zurich. He treated patients like you did, but he very often included the horoscopic analysis with the individual patient. Did you do that too?
No.
You never tried that?
Well, let me clarify that. People came to see me as a psychiatrist, and I felt that introducing astrology to them would be a kind of a violation of our agreement. They didn't come to me for astrology.
Yes.
And so my goal was to give them the best psychiatric treatment I could. And the astrology was my interest, and I didn't want to impose it on them. I felt that would be wrong.
Yes. Okay.
There were a couple of patients who came to see me who had learned one way or another that I did astrology and asked me to look at their charts. And I
so there you have a point where you could do the same like Ziggy Jung
did. And I did.
How was your experience? Jung had very good experience.
I found it distracting.
So you didn't have the results Jung had. Jung had basically very good results in using the combination.
Oh, it was interesting. It interested me.
Yeah, okay.
But I didn't find a way to make it useful to the person.
Oh, interesting. So it's not for everybody. I always thought that if a psychiatrist would follow Jung's advice or Jung's example, they would have the same experience. But you are an example where it didn't work.
And it probably didn't because of my training. My training was more Freudian. And so I was trained,
that could
be the reason. You
Yeah.
listen intently. You don't impose your own ideas. You go with what the person tells you, and you try to understand it. And when I tried to look at the charts at their request, I found, well, the chart's telling me I should be finding this, which was the opposite of the way I was trained. One of my supervisors said to me, you should read all the theory you can about psychology, psychoanalysis, but when you're in the room with your patient, you should take off your theoretical spectacles and just listen and follow the affect. And
sounds very Freudian. Sounds very
Freudian. Okay. But that's how I practiced. And
so
when I had the chart, I had this conflict. Like, if I'm thinking of the chart, I'm not listening. I'm imposing my view of what I think the chart should say onto the person instead of letting the person show me who they are. It was the opposite.
Did you go to professional conferences in psychiatry a lot of times?
Yeah.
Did you ever meet a Jungian astrologer - psychiatrist?
I met many Jungian psychoanalysts. I never met a Jungian, I shouldn't say that. There was a Jungian psychoanalyst who spoke to the Connecticut Astrological Society.
Okay.
So I met her at a talk, but I don't really know her. I just chatted with her. Did
you exchange thoughts about what we are discussing now, how Jung did integrate horoscopic delineation into his professional work as a psychiatrist? Did you talk with her about that?
No.
So you basically have never talked to somebody who did what Jung did on a Jungian basis?
On a person-to-person level, no.
Oh, okay.
I've read about it. I haven't.
It's an interesting aspect. I believe that could be worthwhile researching whether the Jungian method works only on a Jungian basis. And psychiatry in a Freudian way, combining astrology would not work. Whereas if you would learn Jungian analytic psychiatry and combine, then it might work. So that's a theory I have. So you are sort of confirming my theory.
I've read Jung. I think he's fascinating. Yeah. And I've read articles by people who've had Jungian analyses, but it's always struck me that they go thinking, what can I learn about myself from these archetypes that are being presented?
Yes.
Whereas the Freudian approach is, tell me who you are, and I'm not going to let anything interfere with what you tell me. I'm going to listen as objectively as I can.
That's a different paradigm.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. That's interesting. So I still have to wait for the viewers. If anybody know anybody who is a psychiatrist on the Jungian base, please, I would like to talk to him on my channel, because I think that's an interesting topic. For people who want to read about that, the book about Tony Wolff, it's a sort of a biography of a Californian author. It was published in 2018, I believe. Tony Wolff and something, that is a good book to read about what we were discussing. Now, you are retiring, so we can go into chapter 2, family and context. First question about your wife. She was a professional colleague in psychology. Did she continue to work, or did she stay at home?
Oh, yes, she still works, actually.
Oh, okay. She's a little younger than you.
No, actually, she's slightly older, but I've retired. She has
You retired early, and she's still working?
Well, I didn't retire early. I'm 75 now. I'll be 76 this year.
Yeah, and she's still working.
She loves her work, and she has a small practice, and she's still seeing. She's a therapist, a psychologist and therapist. Yeah.
In free practice.
Yes.
Is she doing free practice in the literal sense of the word, that she doesn't have any connections with the organizations who pay for the patients? Does the patient pay them herself?
Her patients have insurance, so she has that connection.
She has the problem with the institution.
Yeah.
Okay. And you had 2 children.
Yes.
How did you manage 2 people working, 2 children? Did that go well with the children?
I think so. We would have evenings and weekends with them. During the day, they were in school most of the day. And then when they were younger, we had a kind of babysitter person who would be there in the afternoon when they got home from school. Yes. And we'd be home within 3 hours of that time. Okay. If they got home at 3 from school, one or both of us would be home by 6. So.
Okay. How about their attitude towards astrology, tarot, and divination, and things like that?
Well, one of my great frustrations is I hardly know anybody interested in astrology in my immediate circle.
Oh, so
my kids are not interested.
You are an astrological loner.
Yes, my wife, she's not opposed to it, but she's not interested.
Okay. Your wife is a psychologist.
Yes.
What tradition does he follow? Erickson?
No, she's probably a little more Freudian than.
Oh, she's Freudian.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, so no contacts in your inner circles for what you really love to do in your free time.
Correct. That's one of my great frustrations. Okay. And especially as I've gotten older, I've gotten more interested in traditional astrology.
Yes.
And there are very few people, even in Connecticut.
Is that the reason why you like to do talks on the internet? Because you do a lot of talks. I got 30 videos.
Well, I keep getting invited. So
okay.
And I'm retired. And
I
could either watch mindless television or give talks.
Did you ever think about organizing a local group in your local community?
Well, I've done that. When I was first learning horary, a group of us got together once a month, presented charts and discussed them for a couple of years. I've looked into other local groups, and the topics usually are not topics that interest me. They're either the modern planets or things that I'm not into. One of my talk with Charlie Obert was wonderful because he and I were on the same wavelength, the same interests.
Yes. But he's far away, Connecticut,
and
he's in Minnesota,
right.
And you are in Connecticut. That's not
But if there was somebody like Charlie nearby, we'd be getting together all the time.
Okay. And Glenn Perry.
And my interests are very, nerdy in astrology. So.
And Glenn Perry isn't the guy you wanted to see every day, I suppose.
Well, I've met Glenn. We've talked, not recently. And he's much more a modern astrologer.
He is, sure.
And a psychological astrologer.
Yeah, that's true.
And
Okay, so now we go back to our special site and try to do a little bit of the site.
okay.
First question, the cosmology and belief system of Anthony. Do you have a specified cosmology for yourself?
Not a very clear one.
Would you attribute yourself as a Stoic?
Slightly.
Okay.
Okay. In terms of here, it's hard for me to articulate. What I would say is that this division between astronomy and astrology is really the division of modern science versus all that preceded it in a divinatory sense. I see astrology as a divinatory art.
Yes.
And then when I ask why should that work, because I think it works,
yes.
Not always, but how is it possible that we look at the positions of planets and make a deduction, and that gives us a prediction that can be verified? And one of my interests, although I'm not very good at it, is quantum physics. And I keep going back to the idea that in quantum physics, we really don't know what's going on with the universe. We talk in terms of probabilities and these mysterious forces, and we don't really know how they interact very well. And we don't even know how many particles there are. And there's new ones being discovered. And so there's something unknown about the universe that maybe it's that our minds can't grasp it. But there's an idea that some of the astronomical cosmologists have come up with, that the universe really is just information. And that there was this question about what happens at black holes. If an object goes into a black hole, is it gone forever, or is there some trace of it? Or what about the information that describes the object? So I've come to think in this very vague way that the universe really is information, data that our minds take like computers and construct a view of reality from, that we don't live in reality. We live in some model that we construct, and each of us has our own reality. And hopefully we share something in common with what we think about reality. And that the planets and their interactions or relationships with one another and with the stars are bits of information that we, if we're good enough or know enough, we might be able to decode a little bit of, and that will tell us something about what's happening in the universe. And that everything is really connected to everything else. It's sort of like this book about the holographic universe, that if you can study a little bit of it, it really is a reflection of the entire picture. And so that there's a level of the universe which is basically symbolic. And what we're doing in astrology is we're somehow tapping into this symbolic structure, much like maybe a weather forecaster who you look at the clouds and how fast they're moving, what direction they're moving, and where the winds are going, and how the barometric pressure is going up and down, and how humid it is. And given that information, you construct a model of how the weather might change. It's just a model. And often that model is correct, but often it's not. And so that's how I see it. I don't know if I answered your question.
Oh, yes, you did.
I'm not very specific.
It's a sort of cosmology. Did you ever get a hold of Fritjof Capra's books?
Yeah.
What's your opinion on his research?
I haven't looked at it in a long time, so I have to go back and review it.
How about Ken Wilber? Going in the same direction like you?
Yeah. I know a little about him, but I really never in depth. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to the special site. Okay, we talked beforehand. You are not familiar with the Ad Astra project, but
No,
I want to do some marketing for the
sure.
very good work of Luis Ribera and his deceased wife recently, unfortunately, deceased, Helena Avila. So you can look that up. And then here's the advertising for the new book in the Astronova publishing company in Tübingen in Germany, Horoscope and Himmelshäuser. You can read it. You said Grundlagen and Altertum, and you can't understand it. It means horoscope and heaven houses, the basics and the antiquity. That's a book coming out next week. Okay, in one of the interviews in Horary Astrology, you were saying garbage questions result in garbage answers. What do you mean by that?
This one of my teachers, this was I took a computer science course years ago, and he said something like, if you write a program to solve a problem, and if the data you put in is garbage, the answer that comes out of your program, however good it is, will be garbage.
Yeah, that's true. I was a programmer myself, that's for sure.
Garbage in, garbage out was
Yeah,
his phrase. So he
that's
said, you have to be careful if you're programming.
For computer, that's right. But you were mentioning this sentence in the context of doing a serious, spiritually grounded horary astrology, and that was what I would like you to elaborate.
Yeah. Well, I hope I didn't offend anybody.
No.
But what I had, if there's a number of horary astrology groups on Facebook and other sites, and if you read through, there's a lot of questions that to me seem very silly. That to me, horary astrology is a sacred art.
Yes.
You're basically saying to the heavens or the deities or whatever you believe in, I have a problem. I need divine help to understand this problem. Can you, whoever or whatever you believe in, please give me some signs, symbols, omens to help me understand what's going on in my life. That's how I see horary. And then I read a question. I met this guy in a bar a couple days ago. He took my number and hasn't called yet. Do you think he'll call me? And I'm thinking, why would I bother the deity to find out if a guy who took my number is going to give me a phone call? I mean, if I were the deity, I'd be pissed. Like, you should be doing something better with your life. But maybe that's just my bias.
No, you are a good tradition here. Vettius Valens and William Lilly both sort of advise.
And Bonatti would say,
pray before
do all you can to answer the question for the next 24 hours. Pray.
Yeah, pray.
Try to find
meditate.
The answer. And if you still don't have the answer, then we'll ask the gods.
Then you ask the questions, right?
Yeah. And that's I subscribe to that.
Yes, okay.
Or I've even seen some people ask, I'm watching a series on television. Oops. Are you there?
Yes.
Oh, okay. For some reason, there was a flash.
Oh, okay.
I'm watching the series on television. I can't wait to know what's going to happen in the next episode. What will happen in the next episode? I'm thinking, is that a valid horary question? I want to second guess the author of this series to find out. So I have to wait a week to find out what's going to happen.
Yes.
And that's what I meant. How can you expect the heavens to take you seriously if you ask such things?
Yes.
That's called. That may be my bias, but.
No, that's not bad. That's the spiritual requirements for horary astrology. In Deutsch, spirituelle Voraussetzung für die Stundenastrologie. Yeah. Okay, the viewers can click on this link and they come into Louis' blogs. I recommended this very highly. We will talk about that later, about specific. And then you have a Facebook, like most people do. I recommend that as well. And there is a biography. Unfortunately, it's in German. Yes, it's in AstroWiki in Zurich. and there is a data bank information about your biography, so you people can click this on. Next interesting topic, solar returns. In one of your videos with your host, you were talking about taking the birthplace for the solar return or the location. And you did talk about Trump in 2016, and you did talk about Abu Mashar and his book about Persian nativities translated by Benjamin Dykes.
Right.
Now, let's start with a general question. You are on the side of the people saying the solar return should be taken with the birthplace and not the location, right?
No. Yes and no.
Yes and no. You did say that in the video.
I did say that. My opinion has changed over the years.
Oh, you started with birthplace and now you're on location?
Years ago, I think when I first met Robert Zoller, he said, read Marinus. Right? This was probably the late 80s. Yes. So I read Marinus, who insisted you should do the birthplace.
Yes.
And Marinus, I thought, was brilliant. So I did the birthplace.
Yes.
But I always also looked at no, Marinus said use the current location. I'm sorry. I said that wrong.
Okay.
Marinus said use the current location. I'd been using the birthplace. For me, it didn't matter much because I was born in Connecticut and I moved not far away from where I was born. So, and so I didn't have much experience of my own chart, seeing the difference. But looking at other people's chart, I began to use both. And Marinus, his argument was very logical and scientific that you should use the current location because that's where you are at your solar return. It's a real location.
That's a scientific approach which needs the philosophy that there is some sort of causality between the planets and the location.
Right, that was his argument.
If you go back in antiquity, that's not relevant there.
Right, but what I learned in this fascinating in going back is that in antiquity, you started with the birth chart, which was the root chart, and it didn't matter where you were on your birthday because you were it was sort of a form of progressing the chart. And actually, you just took the length of the year and added it to the birth and then got the next chart.
Yes.
So you were just progressing the birth chart forward through solar return. They weren't even called solar returns. They were called annual revolutions.
Revolutions, yes.
And it was the return of the year, not of the sun. And what also interested me, because I checked with Ben Dykes about this, in one of his books, he made the point that Abu Mashar used the tropical year for the solar revolution and the sidereal year for his mundane work. So there were two different forms of revolutions. And I haven't been able to find in Mashar why he made this distinction, but apparently he must have thought that in mundane astrology, the sidereal positions or yearly intervals are more significant, whereas in individual personal astrology, the tropical year is more relevant. And to me, that's a fascinating distinction. And,
so at the moment you are sort of a Twitter, you are birthplace and location mixed.
I do both. I look at both.
How about this book of Ben Dykes published it recently in his series Persian Astrology.
Yeah.
The third volume is about solar revolutions by Abu Mashar. And you mentioned that in one of the videos, which I highly recommend to watch from our playlist, you mentioned that Abu Mashar was talking about 19 categories to formal practices. Do you practice these 19 factors in your own solar revolution approach?
Yes and no.
Okay.
It's hard to go through all 19 because it would take forever.
It's work. Yes,
but I'll tell you what I do. I always look, his order, interestingly, he starts with the perfection. What is the perfected ascendant and the perfected Lord? He then looks at, I think second is the Fardaria. Second is the divisor and the participant, the distributions. Third is the Fradaria. Fourth is the Lord of the Orb, which a lot of people have never heard of. And then fifth, he looks at the solar return ascendant and its Lord. And then I think sixth, he looks at the moon, which is obviously important. And then he goes on and on and on. He starts looking at lots and all the other factors in the chart. So basically, he's going to look at everything in the chart in a certain order. And I've been doing a lot of experimentation with the Lord of the Orb, which I only learned about a few years ago. And it's quite fascinating how that works. That's the planetary hour lord at birth that you perfect basically through the Chaldean order. And that's just fascinating how that works out.
So did you ever do a complete Abu Mashar approach for one chart? Solar revolution?
No.
Would you be interested to do it for? I realized you are rather mutig. What's mutig in English? Courageous. You're very courageous because you did a video on the solar revolution of the President Trump before he was president, 2016. First question. I started a research project today, as a matter of fact, bias control in delineation. Bias control is a real problem if you have if you are a special nativity, a special chart. If you are basically a Taurus guy and a Scorpio guy comes into your office, you might have a bias problem, not realizing that you have a bias problem. That's the first bias problem. And then if you are a Trump hater, a valid Trump hater, and you're doing Trump, that might be a problem. And you have the same problem if you're a strong Trump supporter and you delineate Trump's chart, you have the same problem on the other side.
Yeah, right.
How about yourself? How do you control? You have an opinion politically of this guy, certainly. Yeah. You might hate him or you might like him or you might try to be neutral and don't interest politics. But bias control is a problem. How do you deal with bias control in this very extreme case of Trump on the one hand, and then in the everyday astrology on the other hand? How do you deal with bias control?
Okay, what I've taken to doing, I don't remember what I said in that video about Trump, by the way.
Yeah, okay.
But, and I'm biased against Trump. I'm not a fan of Trump.
Would you say you are a Trump hater or are you a moderate Trump against guy?
I dislike him. I mean, I don't like the word hater. I really dislike everything he stands for and does.
Okay. In my opinion, that would be getting close to it being a Trump hater. But you might not be a patient with TDS. Okay. Trump derangement syndrome is not your diagnosis. Okay.
Well, it's interesting. Being a psychiatrist, I've had to work with and treat people whose actions, like I once had a patient who was a skinhead neo-Nazi.
That is a bias problem for the psychiatrist,
yes. Swastika tattoos.
Yes,
and,
yes. There you have a very real problem.
Jews, yes. Hated black people, but he became my patient.
And you couldn't recuse yourself?
No, but I clearly didn't like what he did and stood for. But I did my best to, I mean, he was a young guy in his 20s who clearly had a horrible history growing up. And there were reasons he adopted this stance. But it was hard at times to sort of be neutral, objective, and helpful. I did it, but it's not easy. So in that sense, what I've taken to doing, and what I like to do is, if there's an item in the news, I think, I wonder what the astrology going on with this is. What I will do is first construct a hypothetical chart in my head, like what would account for this event or this happening, and sort of write out, well, I would expect, Mars to be square Venus or something, and only after I've done my theoretical hypothesis do I look at the chart. So with Trump's solar return, before I even looked at it, I would think, what would I need to see to indicate victory or loss, independent of the real chart? Just what factors should I look for? And then I look at the chart and
you took the wrong chart, you know that. You took the chart with Ascendant on 29 Leo, and I quite recently came about a Kepler College article that he is most likely a 17-degree Ascendant Leo.
I've seen that argument. I don't buy it.
You don't buy it? Okay.
No.
Oh.
No.
How's your rationale not to buy it? Because it sounds rather convincing.
Because his birth certificate is published.
Yeah, I don't care about the publication. I'm talking about this lady in Australia writing a whole book in 1996, long before the presidency was a chapter, and she was talking about the information quality of the sources.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, what she wrote in that book and what the Kepler article, it's linked on the side here. What they are arguing, let's say it's not bad story. You could take it as valid information.
Mm-hmm.
And my question to you is: did you ever check both dates and if there is a difference coming out?
I don't. I may have. I don't remember.
Oh, okay.
I tend to go with documented evidence. And
yeah, I don't, because documented evidence is just a piece of paper. And however the information got on the paper is the real interesting primary source questions. Let's come back to my research project from today. You are a moderate Trump hater, and I'm looking for people. I want to find people. I would prefer you to be a TDS Trump hater, because that would be the best for me, because that bias is the best I can get.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, a real strong supporter of Trump. And I would like, and both being astrologers and both being traditional astrologers. So I'm making marketing for all the viewers. If you are one of these people, either a valid TDS patient or a very strong Trump hater on the one side, or you are a very strong Trump supporter on the other side, and you know how to delineate his chart on the basis of the 7-degree Leo, that's the prerequisite for my research program. Would you like to delve into that research, how we find our own bias when we delineate? It's a project in the field bias control and delineation with the Trump example and a specific chart and a specific approach to astrology. I'm not interested in modern astrology for this project. I want to see how traditional astrology, either Hellenistic or medieval or Renaissance or Lily or Morinus, what are the results with that bias? And are the results different? Would you participate in something like that? Or would that be too much stress for you? Considering this Nazi guy.
No, it wouldn't be too. It would be interesting.
You would like to participate?
Let me look at it. I would be willing to. Yeah.
I'll show the homepage for everybody. I just created this today. Okay. This is this homepage. It has the address delineation.vonabisw.de up here, and the project is here. Bias control in delineation. I request from the people knowledge. I wouldn't request this from you, because you are the very good informed person about traditional astrology. But for somebody else, for people I don't know, I request either the complete knowledge of Hellenistic astrology by Chris Brennan, or alternatively on the Heavenly Spheres by Helena Avila and Luis Ribeiro, or alternatively Dimitra George, Volume 1 and Volume 2. The Volume 2 is coming in a couple of weeks. Ancient Astrology in Theory and Practice. And it has a basis. The project has a philosophy of science basis. It's kritische Astrologie zur erkenntnistheoretischen und empirisch-psychologischen Prüfung ihres Anspruchs by Dr. Peter Niehenke. You can buy this book if you can read German here. And the second book, this project is relying on the Science of Religion, Habilitationsschrift of Dr. Habil Gustav Adolf Schöner, Astrologie in der europäischen Religionsgeschichte, Kontinuität und Diskontinuität, both in German. You have to be able to read German if you want to understand the basics, the underlying basics of this research project. But you can participate in the project if you don't have read the German titles. So we stay in contact with that. I would suggest we too, and whenever you are ready, I would suggest on this project I have it structured in a special in a special subsite, the chart of a president taking Trumps. It's 12 talks, and I would like to start with the Trump ascendant, then the Trump soul, then the vocation, the builder in Manhattan, all different talks. So whoever wants to participate, you can choose one of those topics, or you can do 12 sessions with me, with Peter Niehenke himself, on my older channel. Let me see how I can show you that. I had an older channel, archetypische Astrologie. No, where are those? Archetypische cosmology. And there are some videos with Dr. Peter Niehenke. We did 22-hour sessions with this guy. So just to give you an impression, I'm willing to do a lot of work here. So we talk about that later. Now let's come to the next topic. We had the film list. I recommend again, watch all the videos with John Anthony Lewis. A lot is on this guy's podcast, and we have the Oraculus podcast, and all these videos are with Anthony Lewis, so we don't have to repeat that stuff here in this talk. Okay, rectification. You lost your mother at the age of 8. Now let's come to your family background. Where did you grow up, and how was the family situation? I grew up in a
small town in Connecticut.
How was the family situation?
I have 3 brothers. I'm the second in order. And I said, my mother died just before I turned 8 years old. And my father remarried, I think 4 years later. So,
that was hard for you.
Well, yeah, losing my mother was very difficult. Yeah.
Yes.
I was very close to her, and yeah.
If you look back as a psychiatrist from today, did you sort of experience a trauma?
I don't know if I would call it a trauma. It certainly had a lasting impact, yeah.
Okay.
For example, and one thing, I mean, I entered psychotherapy when I was maybe in my 20s. One thing I had noticed was that every year on my birthday, or around my birthday, I would feel kind of depressed and unhappy, and I couldn't enjoy my birthday, and I could never understand that.
Okay.
And my therapist said, and I didn't know when my mother had died, the date, suggested that I get the death certificate. And when I did that, I just found out I was born September 3rd. She died August 30th, just a few days before. And her funeral was on September 3rd.
Oh, okay.
So instead of a birthday party, I had a funeral.
Yes, yes.
And then all of a sudden, I understood why every year on my birthday, I would just feel down and
yes.
Sad.
Did you control this with your astrological knowledge?
Control meaning what?
No, yeah, looking at the transits, at the progressions, at the direction, primary directions, all the techniques for predictions.
Well, that's how I rectified my chart initially. In my, I think I've mentioned this in another video, but in my teens, I didn't know my time of birth. I couldn't ask my mother.
Yes.
My father remembered it was on a Monday morning, but he didn't know the exact time. And I found this book that said, well, you can use the right ascension of the midheaven. And for people who've lost a parent early in life, if you put Saturn, the number of degrees away from the midheaven and right ascension as your age, so I took my midheaven right ascension, subtracted 7.95 or something, and put Saturn on the midheaven at age 8, or that gave me a birth time of 9:04 in the morning, which fit my father's story. I figured I was born, I knew it was after sunrise and before 10 or 11. So and I used that time for years. And then years later, I discovered in my parents' attic, my father had a notebook that had my time of birth as 9:05. And that really impressed me. And then finally, I got a copy of my birth. I had a copy of my birth certificate early on that didn't have my time on it. So I decided I'll order one again. And at this time I got a full sheet that the hospital wrote 909. So to me, this is like evidence that astrology works, because
So
I come
basically,
up with,
this was a rectification manual, you could say, right?
No, it was an old book that I think may still be in print called The A to Z Horoscope Maker by Llewellyn George.
Oh, okay.
I think it was first published in the early 1900s, and they kept reissuing it year after year.
Is that the only experience you did with rectification, or did you broaden your approach to rectification? Because in Germany we have Dr. Christoph Schubert-Weller, who wrote a couple of books about rectification techniques, and that was a very much broader approach than just looking at.
Oh yeah, I've done a lot of rectifications.
Okay.
I don't trust rectification. I think it's a best guess that may not be a real birth
even
time.
Though it worked on the point in your case.
Right, it worked for me. And I've had it work, whoops.
No.
I've had it work accurately in other cases.
Okay.
Like I remember once a woman called me wanting me to look at her birth chart.
Yes.
And she said, I was born around 7 a.m. I said, can you be more specific? Because that's, that could be 6:30 to 7:30. She said, well, she didn't know. She tried to get her birth certificate. And meanwhile, I said, give me some events in your life. And she'd been through a divorce, and she'd had a hospitalization and a surgery. So using those events, and transits and progressions, I figured about 650 was more likely than 7.
Okay.
And I called her back and I said, I'm going to use 650 for your chart because that fits these events. And there was silence on the phone. And I said, what's the matter? I just got a copy of my birth chart. It says 650 on it.
Okay.
So I've had those sorts of experiences. But then if you look through Astro Databank and you see famous people, and this famous astrologer said 9:57 in the evening, and this famous astrologer said 2:54 in the morning. And there's a group of rectifications, and they're all several hours apart by very noted, experienced astrologers. You have to wonder, what's going on here?
Well, you might not know this, but we have the same discussion with Freud's horoscope, and it's a quite different story because there are two times available, and they are very different. I learned this by Wolfhard König from the Huber School. Let's go back to the site and talk about another topic which I refer to, transgender and astrology. There was a Zoom conference with the Association for Professional Astrologers International. The chair is Sharon Knight. And there was a young guy, or rather young guy, Korean or Chinese, and he was approaching the problem in the modern days of today with 78 or more gender pronouns. And in traditional astrology, we have a problem with the male and female category. And I talked about this yesterday with Lee Lehman, and she said that's solvable. Just exchange male by diurnal and female by nocturnal, and you'll get rid of the gender problem. What's your opinion on that?
The gender problem being, can you identify gender in a horoscope?
No, the problem is that we have the category, this sign is male, this sign is female. You know what I mean? Planets.
Well, but no, we say masculine and feminine, not male and female.
Yeah, that's the same thing for me, basically.
Coming
from the German background, männlich und weiblich. Okay. But there you have the problem.
No, I would agree with Lee. I think the initial distinction was that the day is divided into day and night. There's a diurnal portion of a 24-hour period, one cycle, and a nocturnal portion. The day tends to be a period of activity, energy, and the sun is regarded as more of a masculine figure, meaning more prominent, more outgoing, more domineering, more controlling, more assertive. The night is theoretically the period ruled by the moon. And the moon reflects the light of the sun. So the sun projects out light, and the moon receives and reflects back the light. And so it's basically, to use my Freudian background, it's a sexual symbol. The sun is more masculine, phallic, and penetrating, as in the sex act. The moon is more feminine, receptive, it receives the action of the sun and reacts to it. And so I think that's what the original authors had in mind, that there was a more outgoing, masculine meaning, phallic, penetrating, assertive force, and there was a more receptive force that received the action of the assertive force and reacted to it. And that doesn't denigrate anybody. It's just how do the moon reflects, the sun projects. It's just the way it is.
I have a feeling that a stricter approach, avoiding phallic and categories like that, but using diurnal and nocturnal with that meaning, then you can escape the woke culture problem. Otherwise, you have it on the table.
See, I agree with Freud that at its root, much of our language is language of the body.
Yes.
That we then elaborate and generalize into.
Well, we'll see how this develops, because these main categories in the terminology of Lee Lehman, diurnal and nocturnal, in your categories, feminine and masculine, you are in the problem sphere. I will from yesterday, I will never use masculine and feminine again in any public discussion to avoid all that. Okay.
Oh, no, I would avoid those terms.
Yes. Okay.
I was just trying to elaborate where they might have come from, or where I think they probably came from.
You try that with Katie Newman, you will not survive.
Right.
Okay, books. You have a lot of books. I recommend all the books to look at them. So there's a complete book of tarot. There is horary astrology. There is, all the links are there. There is tarot plain and simple. There is horary astrology, the theory and practice of finding lost objects, the art of forecasting using solar returns, Lenormand symbols, the annotated Rough World's mundane astrology, the journey of the tarot fool around the zodiac. You were quite busy. When did you write? And then the tarot beyond the basics, the geomantic tarot spread, power secrecy of us. I have one question. I realized in the beginning your books were in print and on Kindle and electronic basis. Recently you don't publish them as print anymore. Don't you want to use the print on demand structure for your books?
Well, the books I've mainly done through the Welland publishers, and they usually have them in both forms.
Yeah, but recently there were
a few smaller ones I did as ebooks.
Yes, that's what I mean.
Amazon,
why not print on demand structure for print editions?
Just never occurred to me.
Oh, well, in your country you have Lulu, very easy. And it's not very expensive. Okay, that's the reason you didn't think about it. Okay, well, that's a good enough reason. Now, there is a Papus book translated by Lee Lehman. Did you ever came about it? Initiates Astrology Secrets.
No, I don't know this book.
I just ordered it for myself. I didn't know it either. Okay.
I have a lot of Lee's books, but I don't have that one. That's
okay. Now let's come to your blog spots. There's a lot more we could. Okay. Do you have an opinion on the tradition of Nechepsam Petosiris? And about Hermes Trismegistus, is there anything in your skeptical approach allowing these alleged authors of astrological texts into your astrology approach? Nechepsam Petosiris, Hermes.
From what I know of them, and I've really never, in a scholarly way, tried to investigate.
Yeah. Okay.
These are probably early authors whose texts have been lost completely.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And so whatever they did, we know from what people who did have the text said.
Primary source problem, as in many cases, yes.
And so, I mean, that's my opinion, that probably they were early originators of horoscopic astrology.
So you take them seriously?
Yeah, because I think that's where it originated. I think the tradition came from Mesopotamia into Egypt and the Greek Hellenistic period. Yeah. And there were these texts that existed we don't have anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay. There's a lot of information about Zoltan Mason on this site. I recommend to read all the links. Luis from Mexico. In one of the videos you were mentioning him, and that was a bit short. I want to dive into that. Who was this Luis?
Luis Lesur, L-E-S-U-R.
Okay.
He He's deceased now. He was a Mexican astrologer whom I met way back, probably in the late 1980s at a conference. And we had very similar interests and hit it off and became friends and kept in contact. And I would see him at conferences, or if I was in Mexico, I would always stop in and visit him. He lived in Mexico City. Very good astrologer. He was one of the people who I think he was one of the founders of the NCGR chapter in Mexico. And so he was a teacher, and he wrote a book, a very interesting book. It's in Spanish called, I don't remember the exact, The Lady of Guadalupe and the History of Mexico. And he looks at the astrology of the discovery of the Lady of Guadalupe and how it influenced or reflects Mexican history and the Mexican character. And so he and I kept in touch, corresponding or calling each other for years. He would often call me about horary charts, which we'd look at together. And he had studied with Zoltan Mason, so he was big into Marinus. And there was a book he recommended to me. I think it's a Spanish translation. It might even be of a German text called Rational Astrology.
That could be Sindbad Weiss. Yeah, okay.
Weiss, yeah.
Sindbad Weiss, yeah, okay.
Is that originally in German?
Yes, just a second, yeah. I get it.
Sure.
The most important edition is Sindbad Weiss Astrologische Synthese, Astrological Synthesis. That's the method of Marinus to synthesize the delineation.
So Luis recommended that book. I got it in Spanish, so I read it in Spanish, not in German.
Yeah, okay.
And it's a very good book, very interesting.
Okay. But how did it come about that you started your career as a translator?
Well, I was never a translator.
Well, once you were for book 18.
Once I was, yeah. Rob Zoller had recommended Marinus to me, and Luis had recommended Marinus to me. These were two astrologers who I respected a great deal. And I took a correspondence course with Robert Corey of New York. He teaches a Marinus course. And Robert knew that I knew some Spanish and some Latin. I'd taken Latin in high school. I had to learn Spanish when I started the job that I retired from, because many of my patients were Spanish speaking only, and I didn't speak any when I started. It's very hard to be a psychiatrist and not speak the language of your clients. That's true. So I'd learned some Spanish, and Robert found out that there was an astrologer in Spain, Pepa Sanchez, who had translated book 18 of Marinus, which was not in English. So he arranged for Pepa to send me a copy of her translation. And so he asked me to work with James Holden.
Yeah, it's published in his series, in James Holden's
series. To translate book 18. And so first I read Pepa's Spanish translation, and then I got a digital copy of it in Latin. And I went through the Spanish and the Latin and my Latin dictionary. And I translated chapter by chapter. And then I would send each chapter I translated to James Holden, who would review it and send me notes and say, correct this, and I would do it. And that took about a year, I'd say, to do. And then I guess James got the final copy and published it in his series.
And we have to look at that. And there is an interesting question I found out today before we recorded. It's this book 18, and the translated by Anthony Labruzza and Chris.
That's me. My full name is Anthony Louis Labruzza.
And you were quite interesting in telling me why there isn't the name Anthony Louis included. It's only Anthony Labruzza. And tell us that interesting story for the final part of this talk, which is rather intriguing.
Well, it's not that interesting. It's that when I started writing things and publishing them, or wanted to publish them about astrology, my wife, who's a psychologist who You know. And living in Connecticut, New England is a fairly conservative area, and New Haven is a fairly conservative city. She said, you need to be careful because if you have a psychiatric practice, there's a lot of bias against astrology.
Yes.
Especially in conservative places like New England. If we were in California, it wouldn't matter. So she said, why don't you just publish under your first and middle names as a pen name in astrology and keep your last name for the psychiatry so that it wouldn't interfere with your psychiatry practice. And I thought that was a sound idea, which is what I did.
Yeah, yeah.
And
so it's interesting. I didn't know that. I was looking at the Amazon information. Where is Louis there? He translated it.
My colleagues all knew that I did both. I mean, my close colleagues and friends.
Okay.
I didn't keep it hidden, but it was just a matter of a lot of people write under pen names. And,
yes. And how about this name Louis? It's spelled L-U-I-S, right?
L-O-U-I-S.
Yes. Where does that come from?
Well, it's my mother's name was Louise, so I think I was named after her, L-O-U-I-S-E.
Oh.
So I think my middle name was after my mother, Louise. It's a French spelling of Louis, I think. Louis, King Louis.
Okay, the final part, I recommend very much to look at all these links. These are all links going to the blog of Anthony Louis. All these are very interesting articles. You should read them. And with that, I come to the final question. The 21st December of 2020, Saturn-Jupiter conjunction and the mean conjunction concept of Abu Mashar. That's the final question with a wonderful talk. What's your opinion on the mean conjunction theory of Abu Mashar? He wrote it in the book Religion and Dynasties.
Yeah. I haven't experimented enough with it. It was new to me.
Okay.
I always thought, and everything I'd read about mundane astrology, mostly more modern texts, was that we looked at the actual conjunction. When does Jupiter and Saturn meet up? When do they meet up?
Yes.
Literally in the sky. When do they
like on the 21st of December last year.
Right.
Yes.
And then when I read Ben Dykes, I realized, well, that's not how it was done. I'd also read another book. There's an old book by Pingree and Kennedy from 1971 on the mundane astrology of Mashallah.
Yeah.
Where they have the Arabic text and then they translate it into English and they do commentary on it.
Yes.
And that was the first book that I'm aware, I'm sure there are others, in which Kennedy and Pingree say very clearly that Mashallah used whole signs as houses. And it's 1971. So they were aware of it, these scholars. And I think James Holden wrote an article about it about a decade later.
84 years.
But it was known in academic circles in the 60s and 70s. And basically, the idea was sort of like the solar returns. It wasn't really that important where the sun was. It was you just keep adding the year length to your birth year, and you get a new chart, and that's the important chart. And the sun may be close to its birth position, but probably won't be exactly there. So with the mean conjunction, this was based on Ptolemy's idea about epicycles, that what conjoins is not the bodies of the planets, but the centers of their epicycles. And so the mean conjunctions will differ from the actual conjunctions, often by several months. And those are the ones that the Arabs and Persians used. It wasn't the actual conjunctions. It was the conjunction of the epicycles. And that gives a whole different light on things.
Yes.
And so I don't know.
Okay, you are still
we're doing it.
You are still deliberating the problem.
Well, this is probably why I write my blog, because new ideas come up and I don't know what to make of them. So I try to write about them to get my ideas clear.
Yes.
And I'm sure I've written things in the past that I just wouldn't agree with anymore.
And I give you a recommendation: if your blog posts are longer than 30 pages, you can always print them on demand for
true.
very small amount of money, and it would be available worldwide, and I could buy it as a book and not have to read it on the computer. I hate to read things on the computer.
Well, the thing is, the blog is just ideas I'm toying with, and I haven't come to any conclusion about.
I don't care. You could publish it as a print.
And then a year from now, I might say, I think that's all garbage and we should discard it.
What's the problem? It could still be there. You know, if you have printed it as a print edition, it will go into the libraries. And then it will stay there and somebody can pick it up, and you might have changed and moved on, but the idea might still be valid, and you have published it worldwide. At the moment, if you cancel your blog, it's gone.
That's true.
Okay, that was a very, very nice talk today. I thank you very, very much. And I recommend, as I did before, read all the links, read all the very interesting blog posts of Anthony, and go to the video list, because you have a full program of a couple of weeks if you cover all that. And we keep in contact whether you participate in the research project. We talk about after I stopped the recording. So thanks again to Connecticut, and thanks again to the viewers for stopping by, and I stopped the recording.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.